Hello everyone, just the other day I got a brand new bandsaw. This is a 7" by 12" metal cutting bandsaw that you can get at Harbor Freight. I got this with the coupon. I paid $675 before tax, and it is a beast. This is the new version. If you look on the website and other things, you can see the old green one. This is the new version that they're not really yet advertising because they're trying to get rid of the stock of the old one, and it has a couple cool new features on it. So what I want to do in this video is show you what it takes to kind of get this home, unbox it, unpack it, get it set up, and show you some of the new features of this model, and also compare and contrast it with the old one that I have. This is the one I've been using for quite some time now, and just kind of show you the feature differences between the two because they're both metal cutting bandsaws, but they are pretty different. So let's get started with the getting it home and unboxing. Getting the box out of the 4Runner really wasn't that bad. We just used a couple boards that I had in my scrap pile, put them underneath, and just kind of used them as skids. You know, pretty standard stuff. It worked out okay. However, getting this into the vehicle was a whole nother story. I didn't film that because, well, I didn't really think it was going to be that big of a deal, but the Harbor Freight employees actually spent quite a bit of time getting this into the back of my 4Runner. And the reason is that with the new version of this, it's surrounded by this kind of metal cage. The old version was just a cardboard box with kind of a plywood pallet that was strapped to the bottom, but with this new version it just has this metal cage that's been welded all around the outside of the box, and it's just a cardboard box. There's no packaging or padding anywhere inside of the thing, and it's just kind of bolted to this cage, so laying it over on its side is a little bit tricky, and the overall height of it was a little bit too wide when laid on its side to fit in the back of my vehicle. So what we had to do is actually take off the whole bottom of this metal cage, lay it on its side, and go like that. So it ended up becoming really kind of floppy and difficult because it's just, you know, 350 pounds of dead weight. But with using the skids, it was relatively easy to slide out of the back of the vehicle. Using some furniture dollies, we slid the whole thing into the garage and then just basically hoisted it up on its side and pulled the box and the cage up over top of it. So really it wasn't that bad. To give people an idea though, with everything together, it's about 370 pounds and the machine alone is about 350 pounds. So definitely not a job for just one person, but two people, it's really not that bad. I do apologize for the lack of focus in some of these shots. I had the camera sets kind of overhead shooting down, and I didn't climb up there to check the focus, so unfortunately, sorry about that. One of the really cool things about unboxing this was that almost everything was already put together. The only assembly that was required here was to put on the wheels in the back and put on the little leveling feet in the front. And for the wheels, it was just kind of a rod that went through the holes in the base. You put in a couple pins, put on the wheels, and then put on some pins to hold the wheels in place, and that was it. And of course the leveling feet up front, I just kind of lifted it up, put the feet on, and then adjusted it so that it was roughly level. The wheels aren't the most stable thing in the world, but they're actually a lot better than I thought they'd be, and really you're not moving this around a whole lot, so you don't really need there to be bearings or swivels or anything like that. So it's very utilitarian, but it works out just fine. Before I start talking about the actual bandsaw, I wanted to kind of wrap up the unboxing and tell you a little bit more about the crate and the box it came in, because this would have been really helpful for me to know before I purchased this. This is the box and crate, or whatever you call it, that comes with the bandsaw. I'll give you some dimensions. So overall length here is about 50 inches. And then the, I guess, width or depth here is about 17¾ maybe 18. And then overall height without the base on it is about 38. However, with the full base, it was about 41.5. So the overall height is going to be about 42 almost once you add in the base that comes with it. And I cut off one of these straps here. They're actually pretty sturdy, so don't expect to just take tin snips to this and cut it apart. I'm going to have to use a sawzall or a hacksaw or something to cut this whole thing apart. So this is maybe something to consider if you're looking at this saw. You got to figure out a way to dispose of all this. So yeah, that gives you a little bit better idea of what the crate situation looks like. So here we are in front of the two bandsaws once again. As I mentioned, this really took no time to set up. It was just basically attaching the wheels and attaching the feet, and then this little feed stock out front. So let's talk kind of features and why you would maybe get something like this over the smaller one. So there is a big price difference between these. This one retails for somewhere around, I think, $270, $280. This one over here retails for around $900, so it's talking about 3 times the money. The cutting size on this is a 4x6 cutting area, and on this one is a 7x12, so it's really not that much bigger. I mean, it is bigger, but it's not like drastically bigger. So why would you spend the extra money on something like this? When I first started researching these, I thought it kind of came down to just, you know, kind of power and the amount of material that they could cut, but there's a lot of other little differences. And actually seeing them side by side here, you can see that they're very different machines. This is significantly smaller and much more of kind of a hobby-sized machine. And something like this is obviously a lot more bigger and just a lot more bulky. I mean, the castings are just huge on this thing. Now, this isn't like, you know, an industrial commercial machine. Those get a lot bigger. But for $900, it's a pretty good size and pretty decently capable bandsaw. The biggest difference between these two is how the, I guess, the cutting action happens. So they're both bandsaws, they both have the same kind of configuration. However, with this smaller one, it is actually just a gravity-fed unit. So this arm is just on a hinge, it has a little spring in the back, but the actual downward cutting force is just gravity. You're just relying on this thing to fall down on top of the workpiece. I found that for aluminum and some softer materials, this works out just fine, but if you're doing tool steels or harder things like titanium, this gets a little tricky, and I ended up having to kind of like hang weights off the side or just sit here and kind of press on it, and you don't really get a good constant pressure out of it. However, with this bigger one, it actually has this hydraulic cylinder on the front, and right now it's in the locked position. I can turn it on, and then by adjusting it, I can actually control the amount of, or the speed, I guess, that it comes down. So it's actually really, really slow right now. And so I can just kind of dial this in for what I want. And as I put it up, I can just kind of have it held in place. So very fundamentally different on how the arm actually comes down. One of the other big differences between these two saws is the base. The base on this is just really nice, actually. It has the leveling feet, it has the wheels, has a little handle. You can actually move this around relatively easily, although it is pretty darn heavy, and this is kind of low to the ground, so it's not the easiest thing to move around. You wouldn't really want to move this out for every single time you made a cut, but it's totally doable. I don't actually have the wheels on this right now, but it does kind of have wheels that sit out to the side, and it does have a little handle over at the end. However, this base is very thin, very flimsy. It's kind of the major complaint about this one is just the base is really, really flimsy, and it's very top heavy. As you can see, it has caution tippy written on the top. This one is very tippy. Once this arm gets all the way up, I mean, it is really easy to just tip over. So the overall stability of this one is drastically different than the larger one. And lastly, we can't talk about the differences without talking about coolant. This actually does have a full coolant system. Underneath here there is a trough and a pump, and it goes up to this lock line. You have a little lever here to stop that, and then you have a switch that can control the coolant as well. So you can direct it right on the blade, you can direct it right on the cut, wherever you want. This one standard does not have any kind of coolant. The first owner of this actually did kind of install some kind of coolant system, although it wasn't on there when I got it. Presumably this cut out the bottom was to hold some kind of coolant trough, something like that. But this one didn't normally have coolant, and you obviously don't have a chip tray. This thing makes a lot of a mess. Now, I'm not saying that that's worth $600 difference alone, but this thing just kind of creates a huge mess around it, and it doesn't have coolant, and even if you did add coolant, it would just be a nightmare, whereas this one's a lot more self-contained and simple. So the next thing I want to talk about are kind of some of the upgrades and changes that are on this new model versus the old green one that you see on Harbor Freight's website. As I mentioned previously, this is the new version of the Harbor Freight 7x12 bandsaw. They're not really advertising it, but if you go into some stores, they do have the new one on display versus the old one, so just something to keep in mind. The changes are subtle, you know, they're not like big fundamental changes, but they are really nice little upgrades. For instance, the first one is this little power box. On the old one, it's kind of set over to the side, and this has these nice, I guess, waterproof sealed switches. You've got the on and the off. It's not plugged in right now. And then you have a little booted toggle switch for the coolant on and off. And it's kind of in a nice location. You have really good wire management with actually really nice cable glands and everything. So it's actually, you know, nicely laid out. The other thing is on the old one, this top cover was actually plastic. On this one, it is metal. I'm not really sure if that's a huge benefit or not, but if you crunch into the plastic one, it'll probably break. On this one, it will just dent and you'll have to dent it back. The other big change is the old one just kind of had a little copper line that went down here right onto the blade, and it didn't have one of these lock lines. I'm not sure if it actually had the little valve here, but I think it was just the little copper line that ran down there. So that's actually kind of a nice change that you get this. Color scheme is another change. I don't know if you care about that, but the green one was pretty darn ugly. This one actually looks a lot more attractive with the little red knobs everywhere. Just fit and finish feels a lot nicer on this one. The last big change that I was told about was the coolant reservoir down in the bottom. On the old one, that was plastic. On the new one, that's metal. So let me flip this around and give you an idea what the coolant reservoir looks like. So here's what everything looks like from the back side. We have the big tensioning spring, which can be adjusted here, the back of it. And then down here, we've got the little coolant reservoir. And this actually just pulls out like that. You have the power cord running in, and then you have the actual pump feed that goes all the way up and into the head. And if we pull this out, you've got just a little tiny, kind of aquarium style pump. I'm sure you could upgrade to this to something larger. It's really nothing special. But then you have an all metal coolant trough. And this thing's actually pretty decent. And in the bottom, it has this little baffle in the middle. So theoretically, when it drains back down in, some of the chips would go to one side and this sits on the other side. Because the drain is actually over here. So the little baffle might help kind of separate chips from the pump. And then in the little drain that's down here in the middle, it does come with a little mesh screen. So that might help to keep chips out. And then it just kind of funnels down into this little tube that goes into here. So it's a pretty simple little setup, but should be easy enough to add coolant, change coolant, things like that. I want to talk about a couple other little features that are kind of nice for this saw. They're not really unique to the Harbor Freight model. I think the Grizzly, the Jet, the Enco, they're all pretty similar, but it is unique to the larger models of this. It has this little wire cleaning brush that when the blade moves along, it actually scrapes against the brush, which is actually really handy because on the smaller one that I have, if you're cutting aluminum and if you use a fine tooth pitch blade, you get aluminum shavings stuck all inside the blade. They get stuck all inside the wheels on the inside of the casting, and it just really creates a mess, and then it gets gummed up and you don't cut as well. So actually having this little brush right here is kind of nice. When this thing did ship, it was kind of bent in a little bit, so it was rubbing against the casting, but I literally just pulled it out with my hand and bent it out, and that was fine. Other little things that are kind of cool, it has a ton of adjustments everywhere. So I'm not really going into the quality of the cut or anything like that in this overview because it's been pretty well established that these are very decent saws for the money, and if you set them up and calibrate them, you can get really good cuts. So let's just leave it at that. You can get good cuts out of these things, so that's enough said there. But it has a lot of adjustments everywhere, and it's very simple to do pretty much anything you need to do. There's a little bump stop there, which is the stop position. There's another one back here. The motor is adjustable. The belt change, you can go in there and adjust it. So there's a lot of nice little adjustments everywhere. The other cool thing that I like about this is that the auto stop feature is much nicer on this than my old one. The old one just kind of has a little finger that goes on the on-off switch and just stops it from running, and it doesn't really always work, and you have to constantly adjust it, and it's really annoying. On this one, there's a switch right here in the back that you can hear, and it just has a little adjustable nut or screw that when it goes down, it presses against it and cuts the power. So we'll just set it down. You can listen to it. So it's coming down, and simple as that. So it's actually a really nice mechanism. So fit and finish is actually really good. Let's talk about some of the negatives that I've found so far. The first negative is going to come pretty obvious. It is the packaging. That crate metal banded thing is actually really, really annoying. The Harbor Freight guys even really hated it because it's very difficult to get in and out of trucks, and as soon as any part of that becomes bent, it's just pretty useless, and there's absolutely no packaging whatsoever inside of there other than just the piece of plastic that's covering this. So if that gets bent, you're probably going to have some sort of issue. Another quick note though is if you have Harbor Freight and you're looking for the new version of this, just ask them if it has the metal banding on it. The metal banding is unique to this version of the saw. So interesting enough. I'm not usually one to complain about included accessories. However, this one has world's stupidest included bandsaw blade. This is a 6 tooth per inch blade. I don't know what they were thinking with that. A 6 tooth per inch, it's really horrible at cutting metal. I tried. You can see the little metal shavings here. I tried cutting some aluminum with it, and it is really the worst blade for cutting aluminum. 6 tooth per inch should be more for cutting wood. I also tried cutting some wood, and it really just chews up wood. So I don't know what they were thinking, including the 6 tooth per inch. They should have done the 14 that they have on their site, which is a whopping $11. I don't know why they included that high or low tooth count of a blade. It should be a 14 tooth per inch, and I went ahead and bought a Lennox blade, which is kind of the recommended one for this saw, but that's really a wood blade on a metal saw, and a metal saw that moves way too slow for cutting wood. So I'm not really sure what they were thinking, but really, really stupid blade choice. Other than that, I don't really have any negatives about this. There's a couple small casting issues. If you look closely at the head, it's really not that great. There's a couple little voids here and there. I don't think there's any structural integrity issues. It's just not the prettiest that you will see. And right up here on the corner here, there's a little bit of a void or a little bit of a grinding issue. None of these things are going to affect the cuts whatsoever. So let's look at the jaws, and I haven't really seen how square they are, how parallel they are, but let's take a close look at that, and then we can see a thing cut. So here's a close-up on the jaws. I've got a 1, 2, 3 block here just to measure if everything's kind of square. And if we knock this up against it, yeah, you can hear. So this is not perfectly perpendicular to the table. Not a really big deal here. Let's try it more in the back. It's actually pretty square in the back, and there is definitely some rough marks right there. It's not that bad, but yeah, definitely not perfectly perpendicular. These are going to be perfectly perpendicular to each other because this one rotates, and I actually just did adjust that one, but let's just kind of see how that looks. Yeah, so it's actually off a little bit. I'll have to readjust that. It has a lip on this side, but you just unloosen these two bolts and this can swivel around. The other thing to measure here is if it's perpendicular to the blade. So I'm going to run this along like that, And if you can see that, that is perfectly flush with the blade on both sides. The good thing is this rear jaw over here is also adjustable, so this can swing around, and I did do a slight adjustment to make sure that that sits nice. And vertically we can see that the blade also sits perfectly up and down. You can adjust the screw here and here to actually tilt the blade this way and that. So there's a lot of adjustments to be had. The one adjustment that we can't do is adjust the perpendicular of here to this surface. So unfortunately that is a little off, but that's really not that bad. For my purposes, this isn't a big deal, and if you're cutting square stock, it doesn't really matter if the square stock is sitting slightly sideways. So that's, you know, it is what it is to be considered for a saw of this cost. And you notice here's the casting mark that I was talking about. It's just a little bit of a grinding mark right there, but everything else actually looks pretty good. There's no pits or voids or any other issues down here. Let me lift this up. As the spring, so you can see everything looks pretty decent. Considering that I got this on sale for $6.75, I think it was a great value. The last feature I'm going to mention about this saw is the vertical table. So you can move this up vertical, and there is an end stop down there that you can adjust, and I think there's a way to kind of lock this into place in the vertical position, although it stays pretty good mostly because of the cylinder. This is the table that comes with it. It's a little vertical table that you undo these two screws. That kind of slides on there like this. And then you replace the screws, and then that sits like that. It does have a little other arm that attaches here and then attaches down to the saw, but you actually have to take off this piece and then attach it through it. So it's kind of a pain in the butt, and I will not be using this because I found as soon as you start to tighten it down, these two fingers in the front kind of bend up like that, and this thing no longer becomes flat. This is relatively thin metal, and it's just really not that sturdy and not that nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a thick plate of aluminum, take it to the water jet cut guys, have them cut out a new table, add a couple holes, add the little throat for it, and I'm just going to kind of make my own table, and they might figure out a way that kind of makes it snap quickly on there somehow. I do want to use this kind of vertical like this. It is nice to have, but this really isn't the right way to do it. It just kind of feels like an afterthought, and I'm sure it was an afterthought, but there's a better way to do the vertical table. So that's another little check for the con column of this, is the vertical table really isn't all that usable. It's probably usable in a pinch, but you wouldn't want to use that as one of the primary purposes for this saw. And of course I can't conclude this overview without showing it cutting some metal. This is a 2-inch diameter rod of 6061 aluminum, and I'm cutting it with the newer blade. I'm not using coolant, obviously, as you can see. I just didn't have any coolant in my shop at this point. I'm waiting for it to ship, and so I haven't filled up the coolant reservoir yet. It cuts as you would expect. I think it's been pretty well established that these things have, you know, really decent cutting capabilities, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like. You can see that I did another cut on this piece of aluminum as well, and it looks like there's a lot of heavy saw marks, and it's really interesting. It's actually a lot smoother in person than what it shows on camera. You actually can't really even feel those saw marks. It actually does leave a really nice cut on it, but in any event, here is what it looks like cutting aluminum. So this is my overview for the Harbor Freight 7x12 vertical horizontal bandsaw. It's really not a review. I want to call it an overview because I really, haven't owned this for more than a couple weeks. So maybe further down the road I'll give a full review of it, but there's so many of these out there and people generally like them, so I don't know how much that's going to be worth it, but this at least shows you what the new version of it looks like. So as always, thanks for watching. You can check out my Facebook page for more updates and tool scores and things like that, or you can check out my Patreon page to see the channels that I support or also support my channel. So again, thanks for watching. See you next time.